Hello, I'm Sarah Montague.
And I'm Evan Davis.
Now, with the recent trade deal signed with the US and India and hopes that one is about to be signed with the EU, Evan and I thought we should address the question of whether 4 years after the UK left the single market and customs union with the EU, we could say that Brexit is paying off. Now, Evan, not an uncontroversial question. Everybody's going to leap on us.
And I'm not going to give you any opinion of my own, Sarah. I'm going to quote reputable sources who've thought and looked at this.
Of course we
And
are.
that's all I'm going to do. But we've got a lot of data, obviously, from
OK, but we do need to start. There's one particular number we need to start with, which is 4%, or at least 4% of GDP, because that was the forecast. And it was the forecast hit to the UK economy.
So this is the Office for Budget Responsibilities, which is the official government bookkeeper, if you like.
And
they say long-run productivity, that is, over the long run, we will be 4% less productive as an economy as a result of the post-Brexit trading relationship. And they said that based on work that was done before Brexit, and they stand by that. So that is, if you like, the official figure of what it cost us to leave the EU. And by the way, their view is that of that 4% hit, 1.6%, so 1.6 of 4, had occurred by the time we signed the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU. So we'd already, by the time we kind of finalised our arrangements, quite a big hit had been made because, you know, there'd been a less investment in those preceding few years as companies didn't know what was going to happen and they were holding back. So we've had a sacrifice, but over the long term, 4% is the figure that the government...
And they're still holding to because we're on track for that.
They haven't changed their mind and they seem on track for that. And, I mean, a lot of what they... there has been some really interesting stuff happening in our economy that we have not reported, I think, adequately. But the essential, thing that has happened is that, and they do track this, is that if you look at our trade in goods, that's physical things, that has fallen behind the rest of the G7. So we have had a rather bad performance in goods. In fact, at the end of 23, this is a little out of date, but at the end of 2023, our goods trade was about 10% below where it had been pre-pandemic. So there was a kind of quite big hit there. Rest of the G7, the other big economies, their goods trade had grown over that period, as had shrunk. So that, if you like, is assumed to be a Brexit effect. Our trade in goods, things that were flowing across the border, there were now frictions and inhibitions, and that was the hit. But, Sarah, the really big story, underreported, is the growth in our exports of services. Now, in fact, it's not, in this particular case, financial services. The city has been a bit hit by Brexit. But our growth in service exports, this is consulting, it might be architecture, it might be IT services. There are lots and lots of commercial services. Our growth has been the strongest of the G7 since Brexit. Service exports have overtaken goods exports. We export more soft stuff, the invisible stuff, than the actual physical stuff. And that has been the bit that has really held us up since, held up as a, can be held
And is
high.
this to the EU as well as the rest of the
world? Well, I mean, interesting, a lot of that is to the EU. And in fact, there's been some switching of goods trade from EU to non-EU. But you know what? The EU remains our biggest trading partner, remains about half our total trade. Service exports have, been big to the EU. They obviously go well beyond the EU as well. So there hasn't been this massive switch from a European-focused economy to a global economy. That hasn't happened. There hasn't been a renaissance of physical industry, manufacturing. No, that has not occurred outside. It's been more of what this economy was strong at already, which was exports of commercial services.
Evan, that improvement in services, is it because of Brexit?
It might be related. I mean, obviously, we had a pretty big devaluation in the pound post-Brexit, which made industries more competitive internationally. Basically, it cut our prices internationally. In that sense, it made us a little bit poorer. But that boost from the exchange rate might have made our international services more competitive, yes.
So does it matter? Does it matter if the economy shifts in that direction?
Well, I think one thing that you would say would disappoint people about that particular pattern, that services have held up better than industry, is that obviously that's exacerbating, if anything, that rather kind of north-south imbalance. The international service economy is led and dominated by one city, London. And I mean, I'm just quoting here from one report I read. It said the export-heavy industries, especially in the northeast, are particularly affected by the Brexit changes, as the cost of navigating post-Brexit trade continues to be a slow-burn, disruptive process. So it's been harder, if you like, for those industries of the northeast. Those have struggled with Brexit more than the London service exporters, the consultants and the like.
So can we come to what the hopes are or expectations for the EU summit? Because when they're actually quite limited, or at least on the face of it, they look very limited. And, the world has changed and there is more of a focus. The number one priority is on defence and coming up with a security pact. Can't rely on America anymore. But beyond that, in terms of this reset, and perhaps, some people would say salvaging something from the Brexit relationship. Some would say, well, no, this is marvellous. What are we likely to get?
Right. Well, we're likely to get something on youth mobility. Don't know quite how it might occur, but let's call it a sort of light version of free movement for some limited period for some number of under 30s. So that's one, and it's quite hard to put a figure on how significant that would be. The big one that the British government has said is its, if you like, big reset priority on the economic front is a veterinary agreement, which would take away border controls on animals and plants. So basically, we will accept their rules on all of that, go back into the EU for all intents and purposes on animals and plants. And that's a very big boost to agricultural trade. And actually, there's some work has been done on that. Now, most of our agricultural produce is not traded, so it's not relevant to a lot of what our farms do. But there has been a pretty big hit to UK agri-food exports to the EU post-Brexit. And you would probably, the work I've seen, you're going to get about 25% growth in our exports to the EU, our food exports to the EU, if you get that veterinary agreement. So that's not insignificant. More choice for consumers. It's easier to import. Yeah. Probably some benefit in prices because barriers are being reduced, the cost of trade is being reduced, so stuff we're importing might be a little bit cheaper.
So this, because Best for Britain did some research, Frontier Economics. I don't know if it's the same research.
No.
They said that if you had this regulatory alignment, you can get growth of 1.7 to 2%, which means you're, as I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, you're undoing half the damage, economic damage of Brexit, just by having regulatory alignment.
Growth of 1.7% is different to a level effect of 1.
I had a funny feeling you might be going.
No, so if you could get growth of 1.7% year after year, that obviously is massively useful because it's 1.7% and then you've got another 1.7% growth the next year. I don't know that study, Sarah, so I don't know whether that is endless growth of 1.7%. But people often confuse these things and they are very, very different.
But we end up in a situation where just by realigning on the various regulations, you can save a lot of money.
Well, look, you might because companies might feel if the UK is part of a European single market in some industries, they would be happier to invest and put their plants here. So you get a growth dividend, from that. One of the interesting things, Sarah, is that when you look at these trade deals, the numbers do come out as very small in general about what benefit you get from them. And so short of re-entering the whole single market and customs union and removing all frictions on trade, I think the effects would probably be quite small. The India one, the official figure on the India one, the India trade deal is by 2040 we'll have a 0.1% national income boost. that's a good day in the office, isn't it? 0.1%, but it's not life-changing. The CPTPP, that's the Comprehensive Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we joined, much lauded. The official estimate is that's going to give us 2 billion of extra income in 2040.
0.08% increase.
And these are all very, very small.
But what we should say, and I think, and those, if for a lot of people, the idea of being able to do this, which we wouldn't have been able to do before, has a value in and of itself.
I think that is a value that individuals will put on, for themselves. If you said to Canada, you could be 5% richer by joining the United States, would the Canadians say, yeah, we'll take that and let's join the United States? I think a lot of them would say, shove your 5%. I'd rather be Canada. And so these, obviously, people are very entitled to say, there are trade-offs. And there are, it's worth saying, there are some specific Brexit dividends apart from the trade deals. The government highlights data protection. They think they're a few billion of extra benefit coming from different data protection rules. The immigration rules we have are different. Obviously, the government made some changes and then apologised for them. So probably we haven't sorted that out in a way that those supporting Brexit would like. And then you could look at the EU's AI regulation. Many people have said, thank goodness we're not in that. They're overdoing it. We're going to be a better jurisdiction for investments in AI. So, there are dividends and there are freedoms that come with Brexit. There are undoubtedly costs in terms of frictions, and the big surprise is that the British economy has not materially has not suffered relative to our European neighbours. We've grown at about the same rate as France, Germany. We're not completely out of line with the Europeans, and our services have done very well.
So we're not answering the question particularly, is Brexit paying off? But what we can say is that 4 years after we left the single market and customs union, there is no sign economically or politically of in any way rejoining.
It's just worth saying on that, it would be very difficult for this economy to rejoin single market or customs union without rejoining the EU, because if you rejoin it, you are then entirely subject to European policymakers telling you what your policy is, your international trade policy or your regulation of all your products and services, without any say in it. And I think a lot of neutral academics who've looked at this just say it's a very difficult thing for an economy, the 6th or 10th biggest economy in the world, depending how you measure it. Really hard for it to say we're just going to outsource all regulation and trade with no say whatsoever in it to the European Union. That would be quite a big thing for this economy to do.
Evan, thank you.